Hi, everyone. I'm so glad that you took time out of your day to join us today. We are going to have a conversation about national security and immigration. For those of you I don't know, which is probably most of you, my name is Christy Statz, and I am the Pennsylvania mobilizer for Bibles, Badges, and Business, which is a program of the National Immigration Forum. And we love to convene these conversations, these webinars, and eventually, again, hopefully in-person talks to engage the questions that are on so many of our minds about immigration. It's often, we see things in the headlines in the news, and we often don't get the opportunity to talk to experts or to talk to people who are on the field doing this kind of work. And so we love to be able to bring these to you. So today I am super excited about both of our speakers, Elizabeth Neumann and Pastor Luis Luna. We're going to start with Elizabeth, and so we're kind of going to hit two different angles of this conversation on national security. I'll get into more of Pastor Luis's bio in a little bit, but Elizabeth is the Chief Strategy Officer for Moonshot, which is a social enterprise working to end online harm such as violent extremism, disinformation, child sexual exploitation, gender violence, human trafficking, etc. If you've heard of her before, you probably most have heard of her as the former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the Department of Homeland Security under President Trump. She is also a founding member, I believe, of the Council of National Security and Immigration. I'm going to stop talking and give it over to Elizabeth, and then we'll transition over to Pastor Luis, who is actually calling us from Honduras, and he's going to talk about a lot of the push factors that affect folks fleeing their countries and needing to seek asylum. And he's going to talk about the great work that him and Christians in his country are doing to try and address that. But first, we'll talk with Elizabeth.
Well, thanks for having me, and I'm very much looking forward to Pastor Luis's comments, because I think that is so much the more important part of the conversation is understanding what's happening in the world around us that's perhaps driving very, very desperate people to seek safety. But let me start with my background. I'm not an immigration expert. I spent 20 years working on counterterrorism from the Homeland Security perspective, primarily around what state and local law enforcement and state and local Homeland Security advisors do to try to keep us all safe, and what the federal government can do to help them in their jobs, things like information sharing and making sure that they have the right intelligence to understand the threat picture that their particular jurisdictions face. When I came back to government, I spent 7 years traveling around the country with my husband following his job. We lived in Denver and Seattle and Dallas. And Dallas is where I'm from. I came back into government in 2017 after being asked to join the Department of Homeland Security in the Trump administration. I was for a year the Deputy Chief of Staff for John Kelly, which primarily means you're running, making sure the trains are running on time so that the secretary can get through his day. And then I moved over to her policy office and became the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism. And while I was in that role, that counterterrorism role, I oversaw a number of teams, but one of the teams that I was responsible for did screening and vetting. And the president's executive order, which is commonly known as the travel ban, also contained a number of requirements about enhancing vetting on a number of different populations, including refugees. And so I ended up becoming much more intimately acquainted with our refugee processes, our programs, and how we vet. And when, I think remembering the timeline kind of helps. That, if you recall in 2017, we had just come off of a year of a spate of attacks that were largely driven by ISIS, people self-radicalizing. You had an attack in Paris that was really devastating, the Bataclan Theater. You had an attack here in the United States, the Pulse nightclub, which was one of the most significant terrorist attacks that we've had since 9/11. We also had Sam Bernardino a few months before the Pulse nightclub. So in 2016, we as a country were grappling with like, what is happening overseas? How is that leading to these attacks? And it's understandable why in the dialogue of the presidential election, there were conversations of we need to do a better job with vetting. While I disagreed with the tactics as a counterterrorism person, I was, very much in agreement. Like, we got to make sure we know who's coming here and that they don't have any nefarious intent. So when I put the new role on and dug into our screening and vetting systems, I came at it from a perspective of we should be able to do better. What I learned is that, in fact, we had been doing better and that we were making progress in our vetting capabilities. But some of the anecdotes of people that have been able to migrate to the United States and then perhaps were arrested on terrorism charges or attempted an attack, they had migrated to the United States many years prior, well before we started enhancing the vetting that is around determining whether somebody gets a visa and can come to the United States. So there was a bit of a lag, right? And which makes sense that we would, think you see an attack, you hear anecdotes of like, these are people that originally came from overseas, but in fact, they might have migrated 10 years earlier, 15 years earlier. And by the way, they weren't radicalized when they came here. They didn't come here with nefarious intent. They radicalized when they got here, which honestly is a different problem. It's not really an immigration problem at that point. It's trying to better understand radicalization factors, which is part of the reason I ended up joining Moonshot, the company I'm with now, because we're trying to better understand how you disrupt radicalization processes, especially when you're exposed to content online. So what I became really intrigued by as I dug deeper into, say, the refugee program or into our processes around asylees or our processes around any sort of non-immigrant visa, which would be like a travel visa or business visa, as well as immigrant visas, people that are wanting to permanently move here, is I became fairly convinced that we're doing a pretty good job. Now, there's always room for improvement. I could tell you horror stories of bureaucratic inadequacy around our IT systems. There are some processes that are still paper-based, which is kind of atrocious. And there's absolutely room for efficiency improvements, and then connecting IT systems that operate at what we call the high side, the classified level, and making sure that unclassified levels can appropriately talk and compare notes, if you will, to make sure that if we know somebody's a bad person, that gets flagged for somebody that might not have access to those systems. There's still room for improvement, but a lot of the improvement that occurred during the Trump administration actually were things that the 9/11 Commission told us to do 15 years earlier. And it just takes government that long to make some of those improvements. So for all of the talk of extreme vetting, a lot of what actually was being worked on and what was being addressed was kind of underway during Obama, and it just was the continuation of really U.S. policy for about 15 years. And so I became kind of concerned that, again, I look at things through my counterterrorism lens. And then when I had a chance to kind of step back and watch the dialogue in our country, the dialogue did not necessarily reflect the reality. The dialogue made it seem like we were facing, very dire consequences of bad people exploiting systems like the refugee system or the asylee system or the Southwest border. And the reality is that is just not very accurate, that we have become very good at building up a layered defense system that make it actually pretty hard for somebody with a nefarious intent to make it into the country. and quite frankly, that our biggest problem today, as it was even 5 years ago, is not the problem of bad people trying to come in, but people who are already here, including US citizens, who stumble across content that feeds grievance, and they have vulnerabilities in their life that predispose them to being radicalized and potentially radicalized to violence. And we have seen this manifest more recently, more on the white supremacist and anti-government extremist space, even than we have the traditional violent jihadist space that we often think of when we think of terrorism, at least for those of us that came into it post 9/11. So my post-government life, I kind of had time to watch the dialogue. It also happened to be an election year, so you would hear more of it. And I just want to be clear, there were things that happened during the Trump administration that I disagreed with. But I think both sides love to use the immigration issue as talking points and as campaign fodder, as opposed to actually working towards concrete solutions. And though I wasn't responsible for the mission of immigration or border security, I was close enough to the people that were to see the frustration of people who are trying to do their jobs, trying to enforce the law, trying to keep our country safe, trying to deal with humanitarian crises south of our border in particular, but quite frankly, it's happening all across the globe. What's happening in Central America is not dissimilar from what is happening to Europe with the African region. We are seeing lots of displacement and people that are migrating to find everything from economic opportunity to escaping violence and dire circumstances like famine and war. So there is an increase in displaced persons, where it's been on an upward trajectory for decades and it continues. This problem set isn't going away. And I felt like the way in which our country was talking about it made it either we want no immigration or you're for open borders. And the more that we just keep talking past each other about the problems and not actually grounding the conversation in facts, and to be fair, this is extremely complex. It is, if it was easy, it would have been solved by now, but the complexity allows politics to kind of get in the way and use it as an opportunity to be a wedge issue and to raise money off of it. And that's not serving anybody well. I'm a big believer, and part of the reason I founded the Council on National Security and Immigration with other former national security leaders, is because we think that we need immigration reform. Like the system as it's currently designed sets everybody up to fail. So we definitely need immigration reform. It is, and I think there have been some reasonable options that have come up in the past that for one reason or another were disrupted in terms of their progress to be implemented. And the reason the council exists is to try to create awareness that it is important that we do immigration reform. It's important for our national security. It's important for economic security, that we reform the laws so that we can do a better job at both keeping our people safe as well as being a welcoming society. And I don't think that those two things contradict. Now, let me add in my faith background as well. I am a Christian by I've been raised a Christian. I am a practicing Christian. I take my faith very seriously. And the more that especially I would say in the last 5 years, when I would read through the Bible, it just jumps off the page how much God calls his people to care for the vulnerable, to care for specifically the sojourner, the refugee. And I was looking around and I was concerned that I did not see that emanating much from the church. And certainly, while I do not believe that you have to take our Christian values and place them on our society writ large, the idea that we historically have been a welcoming society, at times, there have been times in our history where that's not the case, but I think that's part of what makes us a good country. And I would like to see us return to viewing immigration as part of a uniquely American experience and a thing that makes our country healthier and safer. And I'll go back to my main thesis as I was leaving government and had a little bit more time to scan what was going on in the broader conversation. I was increasingly frustrated that security seemed to be used as a justification for not being welcoming. And I don't think that those two things are inconsistent. I think you can be welcoming, and I think you can also screen and vet and make sure that the people we're welcoming are who they say they are, and that they don't pose a threat to the United States. And I think the longer that we delay solving some of the loopholes in the law that create some of the challenges that result in having a lot of people trying to come into our country, particularly from our neighbors to the south, the longer that we delay, like the more the problem's going to perpetuate. So like the current phenomenon of having large groups of unaccompanied minors or Central American families try to come to the United States. I mean, that's relatively new in the sense of, the last 5 or 10 years, but it doesn't, like, even during the Trump administration, for a strict of rules that and language that was used, like, it didn't make the problem go away. And that should cause you pause. Like, if we want to be against having massive amounts of people come to the country, and I would argue that while I want us to be welcoming, I want us to do it in a way that keeps everybody safe. Having people take that very long journey that is very dangerous is not good for the children. It's not good for women. When we I don't know if this is currently the practice, but a couple of years ago when we were at DHS, basically, if you had a girl arrive, whether she was with her family or not, and she was the age of 8 or 9, we would have to give her a pregnancy test because it was just so frequent that girls were raped on the journey up to the United States. It's horrific. I don't want kids having to take that journey. I want them to have safety, and you have to think, how desperate must you be as a parent to send your child on that journey without you? I mean, I can't imagine that level of desperation. So the desire that I have for our country from a government perspective is, let's update our laws so that we can make sure that we are treating people fairly and equitably and can process people much more quickly than we seem to be able to today. And I do think that's possible, but it requires an influx of resources. People and systems need to be updated. But then we have to look at the root causes, and that's where I think Pastor Luis can talk to it better than I could. But our neighbors need help, and you can argue whether that's the United States government's responsibility. I would suggest that absent significant effort, the problem's not going to go away. So from a security standpoint, it helps us to help them, but also from a faith standpoint, as an individual or as a church, they are our neighbors. We are seeing their pain and their cries for help. And so I'd love to see the church more engaged in how can we help our neighbors, as opposed to sadly what I see, which is more of a press for stronger immigration controls, which, again, I'm not saying don't fix the laws. We should fix the laws. But I would love to see the church more engaged with loving our neighbor than about building walls. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Pastor Luis. Christy, you're muted.
I'm muted after all this time on Zoom. I should know better. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I really appreciate that. And we'll get to speak to you in the comments in a bit. Just to remind everyone, we would love to take your questions. There's not a dumb question. You can direct questions in the chat, and I think everyone will see them, but if you're nervous about being seen with your question, you can click that little "to" thing and you can put it to a particular person, and then we'll just read your question anonymously. But feel free to ask questions as you're thinking about what Elizabeth said and as you're hearing what Pastor Luis says. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll see you in a few minutes. And Pastor Luis, I'll have you turn your camera on and join us, and then I'll introduce you while you're doing that. Pastor Luis Luna is calling in from Honduras. He's the assistant pastor at Iglesia de Dios de Victoria in Villanueva, Cortez, Honduras. Hopefully my accent didn't butcher all that. He is a psychologist, a writer, and he's currently pursuing a graduate degree at Lee University. He has 11 years of experience in the social sector, working in the area of community development, strengthening civil society and public institutions. He is part of Cristianos Valientes, which is a faith-based advocacy group that I believe is part of the Association for More Just Society. If I'm correct or not, you can let me know, Pastor Luis. And they are seeking to create a more just society in Honduras. He is happily married to his wife, Andrea.
Thank you. Really glad to be here. It's a great privilege. Thank you, Christy. There are certain phone calls you get that completely alter your life, or have the potential of jolting you back to a reality whenever you've gone a little bit astray. I got one of those phone calls a couple of weeks ago. I was having lunch and my phone rang. I immediately I saw who was calling. It was a leader at the church that I have the privilege of pastoring. So I picked up the phone. I immediately noticed something was not okay, judging by the tone of the voice of the person who was calling. He said, Pastor, I need to talk to you. I want to let you know that I'm not able to keep having a leadership position at church. As a pastor, I'm familiar with this type of conversations, and I said, is everything okay? We can talk if you want. Is everything fine? And he said, well, I just wanted to tell you I'm leaving for the U.S. tomorrow. I'm his pastor. I know his situation. I know that when he says that he's leaving to the U.S., he does not mean that he's jumping on a plane with a work visa or with any visa for that matter. But by leaving to the U.S., he means taking the dangerous journey of crossing the border illegally. I like to think of myself as a persuasive person. I don't know if I am a persuasive person, but at least I like to think of myself of one. And I said, is there anything I can say that will help you change your mind? And he said, no, not really. I quit my job yesterday. We're leaving tomorrow. And then I asked him, what do you mean we? I thought you were the only one leaving. He said, no, I'm taking my kids and my wife. He has two precious, beautiful kids. The oldest one is 8 years old. The youngest one is a beautiful girl of she's 5 years old, and his wife happens to be pregnant. I didn't know exactly what to say. There are some points, usually preachers and pastors. Our ministry is really a lot of it has to do with talking, but sometimes a lot of ministry has to do with just keeping your mouth shut and listening and trying to feel people's pain and understand where they're coming from. So at that point, I felt utterly helpless. I knew certain internal dynamics and struggles that this person was having. So I said, let me pray for you. That will definitely keep you. I'll keep you in my prayers. And of course, when people do this, they don't want to publicly announce that they're going crossing the border illegally to the U.S. They do it in a very stealth mode. They only they only tell to those who are like people who are like really close and who really need to know. So I pray for them. It was a really sad day, and at the same time, I remembered how um, uh, some time ago, my sister, who happens to be an elementary school teacher, uh, she tells of a story in which one time this little girl approached her and said, Miss Vanessa, that's her name. My sister's name is Vanessa. Miss Vanessa, I just wanted to let you know that I'm not going to be, uh, I'm not going to be coming to class next week because I'm leaving on a cavarana, on a caravan. That was her little cute way of saying caravan. This little girl was telling her teacher that she and her mother were leaving in a caravan next week, and that she was not coming to class. The little girl told my sister, I will miss you, and I just want to let you know that my sister lost it when she heard that, and when she told me that story, she lost it, and I lost it as well. Um, in hearing those testimonies, and the the story of this precious girl in elementary school, the story of uh, the my brother and sister in Christ that attended our church is the story of hundreds and thousands of people um, who every day, every week, uh, are are considering leaving the country. They're not most of them. They're not criminals. They're not most of them rapists. Um, they're the majority of them law-abiding citizens who just are trying to find a way of bettering their life. Um, so this begs the question: Why are people? Why are people leaving? And of course, the subject of immigration, of why people leave their country of origin, it has been widely debated, widely discussed. There's no shortage of books on the matter. There's no shortage of forums and topics and articles on the matter. Uh, why are people leaving? There's this paper published by the Gordon Institute of the Florida International University and the Green Center. It's called and Hopelessness and Corruption. And the authors, the researchers in this paper, they one of their conclusions is that more than just the complex interplay of factors of what they call pull factors and push factors in the area of migration, there's usually the reasons why people leave are usually categorized in either pull factors. Uh, that means that the conditions in the countries to which immigrants uh, want to arrive, and those pull factors in the U.S. are things like economic opportunity, things like protection, things like family reunification, or what is known as chain migration. Uh, the father uh, leaves and arrives to the States, and then he wants, of course, to bring uh, his wife, his kids. So that's a very big pull factor. But there are also what they're called, what have been identified as push factors, and there are things like lack of economic opportunity, lack of work, lack of employment, things like violence, high crime, lack of public safety, corruption, which happens to be a big driver. So these authors concluded that more than just the complex interplay of these push factors and pull factors, what they noticed in the migrants that were interviewed for this research paper is a profound sense of despair, a profound sense of hopelessness that was, of course, generated in several ways by the conditions that in which their country of origin presented to them. So, for the next couple of minutes, I want to speak about two of those push factors, and at the same time, how there are things that there are ways to address those push factors. No, at the end of the day, no one really wants to leave their country of origin. Uh, no one really wants to leave their place of birth. No one really. Migration is not anything new. It has been around uh, for for ever since there have been humans around. But and we should also as well theologically, but I guess that's a discussion for another day. We should as well theologically consider how God is revitalizing his global church through these movements of people. But again, that's another discussion. But um, I'd like to speak mainly on two push factors. The first of it is the lack of public safety, the high crime. In 2012, the homicide rate in Honduras was significantly high. Our homicide rate in 2012 was 90.4 per 100,000 residents. That's the equivalent of a war zone, and those numbers are similar to numbers in Syria or Afghanistan. And just for perspective, according to CBS, the city in the United States with the highest homicide rate is St. Louis, Missouri, with 65 uh, homicides per 100,000 residents. Ours in Honduras in 2012 was 90.4 per 100,000 residents. San Pedro Sula, the city where I live really close to San Pedro Sula, was categorized, was identified as the most dangerous city in the world. Um, and it was really bad. High crime, lack of complete lack of public safety. In 2016, the New York Times published an article about that revealed how high-ranking police officers were engaged in the assassination of anti-drug czars in Honduras, in how they were involved in the assassination of government officials, of civil society leaders that uh, were leading the fight against drug trafficking. This generated a public uproar. This created outrage from the people. The people demanded change. The Association for a More Just Society, ASG, was very instrumental in being a part of the commission for the Purge Commission. That was the literal name, the Purge Commission. Its task, mandated by the president, assigned. This was appointed by the president of Honduras. The main task of this commission was to purge the police force. It had been there was evidence of how high-ranking police officers were involved in drug trafficking, in networks of corruption, and in organized crime. In the year 2012 to the year 2015, about 3 attempts of purging the police had been made. It cost around 200 million lempiras, which is close to $8 million, more or less, and only 200 police officers were fired, and all of them were low-ranking officers. However, from the year 2016 to the year 2019, where the purge began, in which ASG was very instrumental, around 6,000 police officers were fired. All of them had links to organized crime or to drug trafficking. Six of those police officers had really high ranks, and they were extradited. And 9,000 new police officers, new recruits, were integrated to the Honduran police force. Uh, the the organic law for the police force in Honduras was created and established during that time. And all of this process of strengthening the police force in Honduras was translated to a reduction of 50% in the homicide rate. That was a very significant change, 50% reduction of homicide rate during that time. The Association for a More Just Society, people that's composed, which is composed of brave Christians, of ordinary Hondurans who really love their country and who have not yet given up on the country, were instrumental in generating this change. Um, the other push factor is definitely corruption. This paper, Hopelessness and Corruption, by the Florida International University, states that although high crime can decrease when there's still corruption in public institution, in government institutions, uh, that can still generate flows of migration because people really feel like there's no confidence in local opportunities. That generates even the migration of skilled. That generates skilled migration, people who are highly skilled uh, but still see no future in their country. That's also known as brain drain. People who are talented, smart, skilled, well educated, and who really are uh, the the people that can lead spaces in civil society in that can become stakeholders that can generate some change in the country, but due to the conditions that they're faced and due to the despair and hopelessness that they feel, uh, they are forced to migrate or to seek other opportunities. So another major push factor is corruption. According to Transparency International, the Honduras occupies the position uh, uh, number 146 out of 198 countries. That's the level of a perception of corruption, which is one of the highest in the region. Um, According to some studies, around 20 to 25% of Honduras GDP is squandered in corruption, in embezzlement. Corruption really is the corruption of the public institutions is really one of the main reasons that indirectly and indirectly is related to issues of poverty, issues of a failing public health system, a failing public education system, and those two, of course, generate and are intertwined, are interrelated with the other social problems that contribute to large flows of migration. And yet, when the darkness is very thick, uh, the light can shine the most. The light can be brightest. In scenarios like this, where corruption has been a chronic problem that has become more acute due to the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, um, in which the population in Honduras saw how government officials created this horrible embezzlement schemes, corruption scandals related to the purchases of mobile hospitals and COVID-19 related medical equipment. Um, Organizations like the Association for a More Just Society uh, created established a methodology of socially auditing the government purchases um, of this mobile hospitals, of this equipment. And that investigation was actually awarded by the World Justice Project. It won an award in the category of anti-corruption and open government. And what this investigation created is it contributed to the prosecution of individuals who were responsible and who were engaged in this investment practices, and it garnered a lot of media coverage as well, and it allowed people to see that uh, there are some times that crooked politicians do not get away with it, and that they can be held accountable. And that's one of the things that we're working towards. We are working towards strengthening public institutions. We consider that the way forward for countries like for countries with conditions like the ones that are present in Honduras, the way forward for countries like ours is to strengthen public institutions. There's a common myth in Latin America of the strong man candidate, of thinking that this or that candidate can come and turn things around completely, and in a way that that myth has been perpetrated in the entirety of Latin America due to the weak institutions, weak public institutions, and that is why our main work in the in spaces like the Association of for a More Just Society, the spaces that it provides, is we work towards the strengthening of public institutions. We think we definitely consider that migration is not an issue that will be solved overnight. This is a topic that will a phenomenon that will keep showing up in a way. People will still migrate. Uh, First of all, because it is a human right to migrate. Of course, there's you know, people have to do it through the proper channels and through the proper ways. But we are working and committed to working to contribute to reduce irregular migrations, to address the factors, the push factors that create the need for people to, whenever they feel forced to migrate, to leave. Um, we in at the same time we must remember that given the proper conditions, no one really wants to leave his or her country. No one. Everyone wants to flourish wherever he or she is born. And at the very same time, if you're a Jesus follower, we ought to do well in remembering or in having into consideration that we worship a man who migrated from heaven to earth and who was a refugee, who suffered forced displacement due to the conditions created by a corrupt and perverted regime. Um, so good and faithful Christians, good and faithful Jesus followers can disagree of matters of immigration policy. I'm not naive. I do not pretend that everyone who um, tries to enter to the U.S. in an irregular or illegal manner does not have a criminal background and does not pose a threat to national security. Good and faithful Christians can disagree in terms of immigration policy, uh, but good and faithful Christians should also agree on how to treat the immigrant himself or herself. Um, Thank you. Thank you for this time. God bless you.
You can leave your camera on, Luis, and I'll bring Elizabeth back. Pastor Luna, thank you so much. I just really appreciate your expertise and the work you guys are doing in Honduras. I appreciate your leading your congregation spiritually. And yeah, thank you for sharing stories about people close to you in your life and the hardships that they had to face in order to make those hard decisions. So our questions are open for anyone who wants to send them in the chat. I've got a couple for Elizabeth here from the end of her time. So I'll start with those and then we'll see if any more come through. So Elizabeth, someone asked, what were the organizations you are working with currently? And then a follow-up question was, how do we address both sides, the people who want closed borders versus open borders, and help find a solution for our borders that balances both? So really easy questions.
Right. Okay. On the organization side, I work with the National Immigration Forum, which Christy is associated with, Nora is associated with. And they have, and Nora and Christy, you might want to chime in here. They have some great opportunities for citizens, for faith leaders to participate in at a grassroots level of advocating for change and sensible reform. And look, the organization I was referring to, the Council on National Security and Immigration, CNSI, which I think the website cnsiusa.org. That is intended to be more of what I would call a grass tops organization, where we are trying to influence members of Congress for the most part. This sounds, kind of silly, but especially on the Republican side these days, like everything is about what does the base think? And after 2013, where there was this big discussion on immigration reform, you might remember the talk about the Gang of Eight, and Marco Rubio was a part of it, and they came up with a plan for immigration reform that I wasn't in Washington at the time, and again, this was not my issue, but it blew up and did not pass, and it was like an albatross around Marco Rubio's neck moving into the 2016 election. How could you, you were for basically accusing him of wanting to give amnesty to everybody. And the cascading effect of that is on the just pure little p political side of things, that certain organizations have been able to capitalize on that sentiment and kind of make it a mainstream theme for, if you are a Republican, then you have to be all about strong borders and no amnesty, and there's no room for compromise in the current mainstream of the Republican Party. If you flash back 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, that was not the case. There's definitely been a shift in party politics about what is a workable solution. The thing we're trying to advocate at the grass tops is to say, hey guys, we've been at this. There have been 3 attempts, major, lots of energy attempts at revising the immigration laws in our country. They have all failed, and the problem keeps getting worse. And by the problem, I mean, we keep having more people come to the southwest border. We can't keep up with them. And then, it becomes a humanitarian crisis, which is kind of what we're enduring right now, of there's not enough beds, there's not enough, sanctioned or vetted people to care for children, unaccompanied children that show up. And by the way, the moment that we're in right now, there is still, the government is using a public health law to close the border to asylum claims. When that they lifted it for unaccompanied children only, when that restriction is lifted, and the courts might force the government's hand on this, because there are arguments that they weren't allowed to do that. There are also some arguments that have some maybe good legal ground that hey, at the point at which you're willing to reopen your borders to fly other places that have low, about the same COVID rate as say Mexico, or at some point it becomes clear to the courts that you're using this public health authority more to manage asylum claims as opposed to actual public health purposes. And I'm not an expert in this. I'm just talking more about the politics of it, that what I am hearing is that it is likely that it won't be long before they can't use that public health rule anymore. And so they're going to have to reopen the border to asylum claims. Now, what that means is they could still say, you can't come here for tour, on a tourist visa. We're not going to, or pick another cause. But if you are coming to claim asylum under international treaty and US law, we are supposed to allow the claim. And what we've done basically since the pandemic is basically say, nope, the borders are closed. You can't even present your claim. When Biden came in, he opened the claims for children only. And the argument was there are literally thousands of kids sleeping alone. They're vulnerable on the other side of the border. Mexico can't keep up with it. Would anybody in their right mind, if they had a kid sleeping on their front porch, be like, see ya, have fun? No, of course you're gonna be like, oh my gosh, you're 4 years old. Let's feed you, let's clothe you. That is the proper response. But it has created quite a challenge, because it's not like the US government is very well equipped to care for thousands of children. And so the way in which we try to help them is finding sponsors that are already cleared, usually through the foster care system, or finding a relative who is, we've vetted, they're safe, they are in fact a relative. And so, but that whole process, it's kind of mind-boggling to me that they weren't expecting the challenge, but it kind of got off to a rough start. They still have a backlog of children that need to be placed. So they're living in temporary facilities. It's not ideal, is my point. Now, it's better than sleeping out in the open and being vulnerable to gangs and other potential violence. But there's a problem set there that we should be doing better with than we have. So why do I give you all that detail? The reasons why you see migration flows up and down vary. It could be economics. It could be, in fact, the biggest part of, what you've heard about, like there's been a surge at the border. It's actually not the children or families. It's single adult, usually Mexican males. And we haven't seen Mexican males make up the predominant migration surge for a couple of decades. And that's purely economics. And by the way, that was predictable. When we started in pandemic planning at the department back in January of 2020, before the president said, like, we need a 2-week, shelter in place type thing. Like, this is like, there's something going on in China. We don't quite know if it's here. Anecdotally, you're hearing some stories that maybe it's here, but we don't quite know what we're dealing with yet. And the public health people they were kind of concerned, but like the emergency management people that I'm associated with were like, we need to act now. And the public health people were like, well, we don't quite know what we're dealing with. This is the environment I was in. We set up a working group to start working on the impact to migration in February of 2020. And why does that matter? Because the professionals that have been that live and breathe the flows of migration across that border knew that this was going to have an economic impact, which was going to drive a surge. And they knew it was going to have some sort of a panic effect of, like, we got to get there before the border closes, and we've got to get there for health. Like, we need healthcare. Like, there's nothing here that is going to keep us safe. I want to go there to keep us safe, right? So they expected a surge both before the pandemic was in full force, and then when we didn't know, like, is this kind of a couple of month thing? I don't think anybody was thinking it was going to be a 2-year thing, but they knew that on the other side, there would be an economic driver where people were needing to feed their families. And that's in fact what we've seen is a large number of Mexican males. So why am I giving you all that detail? Because that is today's scenario. I could go back and tell you what happened in 2014 and 2015. I can flash forward to, this is predictable. It will happen again. It doesn't matter who the president is. This is just the way that the world is currently structured, the way our laws are structured, it creates push and pull factors. And until we deal with those push and pull factors, the law being one of those pull factors, it will continue to happen again. So if you're going to fix this, like if you actually care about security, if you actually care about keeping us safe, then you fix the laws. But what I see most of Congress do instead is like, no, there can be like any sort of pathway to citizenship is amnesty, or unless we get our wall, we're not. And you're like, that is just never in the history. Like, go read your history books about how we govern. We are a government that is built on the premise of compromise. You are never going to get 100% of what you want. And that is, I can preach that to Democrats, I can preach that to Republicans, but like, I am the practitioner here, and it wasn't even me, but like my boss is the person held accountable for keeping our country safe. The way that the laws are written makes us vulnerable. Can you please make us safe by fixing that? And yes, it means not everybody's going to get everything that they want in that legal compromise, but it's going to be better than where we are today. So that's what the Council on National Security and Immigration's job is try to, talk some sense into some congressmen. We don't need a ton, but we need enough to where they are willing to compromise. And that takes a backbone, because at the grassroots level, there is a sense on both sides that if you are not a purist then, like if you were to allow funding for a wall, and you're on the progressive or the Democratic side, to a purist, that is an anathema. Well, walls work in certain stretches of the border. They're not evil. They just were manipulated and used as a talking point in a way that was less than helpful. Same thing on pathway to citizenship. There's just no practical way to deal with the number of people that we have here, the DACA population, which, if you look at the polls, like the American people have huge sympathy for the DACA population. There's no way to actually get us back to like a place where we can actually start securing the country. I need to know who's here. I need to know what their name is. I need to know, some biographical data so that if they decide to leave the country and come back, I know who they are and that they are who they say they are. So like I am, as a security professional, I'd much rather know who is actually here. And in order for them to know that, they need to feel safe that it's okay for them to come out and identify themselves. And by the way, that allows them to go be a productive member of society as well, to pay taxes, to get jobs, make sure their kids have access to whatever they need. Like that benefits all of us as a society for them to not be living in the shadows. So all of those factors are just, when you talk through them rationally, like it feels like common sense, but the politics enters the picture. I've got an election to win. I've got, my opponent's going to say that I'm for open borders, or my opponent's going to say I'm for amnesty. And that it makes it difficult for a Republican to vote for a compromise. And quite frankly, it makes it challenging for some of the Democrats who are in certain districts to vote. So we're trying to create that neutral security voice and pressure at the grass tops to say, like, no, we need change. And that is the best thing for security. Stop looking for like the purest answer. We're such a diverse country. You're never going to get, the number of votes that you need for your purest solution. Okay, so that's grass tops. But the way in which the like, quite frankly, you all could help the most is to be a winsome voice to help people understand that, one, this is a much more complicated issue than the talking points they might be hearing on their news station of choice, or their from the politicians that they like to follow, to educate themselves a bit more on the issues. There are a couple of good resources, like if you're coming from the Republicans or conservative view of the world, The Dispatch, which is a news source that is unabashedly writing from a conservative vantage point, but they are very journalistic and not sensational in their reporting. I think making sure you have facts really matters in helping people persuade and understand the issues at hand. And then the faith element is really, I think, really powerful. When you go back to scripture, it is kind of hard to maintain some of the tough stances that many on the right have kind of gravitated towards. So if the person you're talking to is of a religious persuasion, this idea of hospitality, of caring for those in need, is pretty common. It's certainly a Judeo-Christian value, but it's also a common value in other faiths around the world. And just even if you're talking to somebody and it's not so much about the politics, getting them connected to an immigrant in their community or a refugee in their community, and ministering to those people. Christy, I know I've heard you talk about this and others at the forum talk about this. Like, there is, like, something changes when you start putting a face to like the label, and it helps us go like, oh, you're human just like me, and they're, but for the grace of God, that could have been me. Who's to say I could have, what if I was born in Honduras, and what would I be doing if my children were threatened? Like, what kind of decisions would I make? And when you put the humanity back in the debate as opposed to like the talking points, it changes the way we think about it. That doesn't mean we don't still have to solve these public policy problems, but I think we've divorced it from the humanity. And that's where the faith community can really help, is reconnecting us to the humanity of this challenge. And honestly, the way that we ever will make progress in this country is because the grassroots shifts. The grassroots then tells the politicians, like, oh yeah, we do need to fix this problem. And so your advocacy within your community, it might seem like you're only changing one or two hearts or minds, but that's where we're going to see the change, is at the grassroots level. It's really not what we're doing in Washington, D.C., though we try to pitch in where we can.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So we're going to go a little bit over because we have some extra questions. So I know some of you might have the end of your lunch break. Thank you for being with us. But if Elizabeth and Luis can stay here for a few minutes longer, we'll do a couple more. Is that all right? Just to let everyone know, I will send a follow-up email. This is being recorded, so we'll send you a link that you are welcome to share. You can put it on your social networks or just share it with your neighbor. And I'd really encourage you, if you're having some of these conversations, or you've heard that this is like a question folks have, especially share with those folks in your life. This would be great for a Bible study to actually listen to, and then to like dig into scripture together. So if your small group from church wants to engage in this, just before we started the recording and it went live, Pastor Luis and I were talking about, the real discipleship need in the church. Sorry for those who aren't Christians, and that's such a weird Christian word, but the need for us to dig into scripture on, what does biblical justice look like? And so as him and his community in Honduras are going, well, we have to address corruption, because corruption is driving our folks to flee our churches and try to go to another country for safety. Like, I can't ignore that in my community. So we all know as Christians, like, we want to share the gospel, we want to point people to Jesus, we want to help feed the hungry, but actually in his community, you can't ignore that. And so, for us to think as Christians through the whole context of scripture, get into some of those Old Testament prophets, it'll really push us to engage with this in a different way. So I wanted to ask you, Luis, and then I'll go back to Elizabeth with just a couple more questions. But just to, I guess, finish that thought, I'm jumping a little ahead of myself. So everyone will get an email. You'll have that link. I'll also have some links for you guys in Pennsylvania to do advocacy with your senators. And I know for some folks that's really weird, but I'll put a little script in exactly what you could say. So, and you could put it into your own words, but how can you ask your law makers, so Senator Casey and Senator Toomey, to fix some of our immigration system and to call them to immigration reform. And you don't have to know fancy language to send them messages. And so the other day I got an email back I got a handwritten letter from one of my senators, and I was so shocked. I was like, what? And so, they are paying attention to what their constituents say. And I was like, I just can't believe that. So I'll put that in there. And, if that's a first step for you, we could do that. And then with what Elizabeth mentioned earlier about, one of the ways is, needing to care for unaccompanied minors. If you guys mark your calendar for August 31st, we're actually going to be doing an event virtually with all 3 chapters of Bethany Christian Services across Pennsylvania. So whether you're on the west or the east or the center, there are 3 different chapters of that organization, and they offer opportunities for people to do temporary foster care for kids who've come here by themselves, and the government is trying to find out where is their family. So until they can place them with family members, we need folks who are vetted. And so we'll talk about more about those opportunities with Bethany at the end of August. And I'll make sure that this group of folks listening gets that opportunity. So just a quick question for you, Luis. You guys mentioned that, one of the things you did was get a cleanup of the police force. What does the average Honduran who is trying to see corruption stop within the police force, what did they do? Like, what did that cost them in order to see police members who are involved with cartels and gangs get fired so they could hire new people that aren't doing that? What did that look like for your community?
In terms of results, outcomes, or is the question?
How did you do that? So how did that even happen?
Okay.
Yeah.
This was a very long process. Uh, the credit definitely belongs to people like Pastor Alberto Solórzano, Omar Rivera, Vilma Rosales, Jorge Machado. One of the members of the Police Purge Commission suffered an attempt, a murder attempt. Two of his bodyguards were shot. One of them was murdered, and he had to flee the country. That's how, in terms of individuals, this man had to relocate his entire family. He had to move from the country. Members of the Police Purge Commission, their families had to leave the country. They stayed, but their families had to leave. They were really touching high interest in the networks and organized crimes in which the police force was involved. So in essence, of course, I'm simplifying a very complex process, but it it began with vetting the police officers who uh, were what happened what happened previously before the police purge commission is that people put some police officers were accused of being involved with organized crime, but corrupt and crooked judges placed them back in the police force. So it was a back and forth process. So the police commission, the police purge commission, what they did is, and they had authority. This was a commission appointed by the president. They created a legal framework, a law, an organic law of the police force, in which police officers that were charged with corruption, they were prosecuted, and there were those who were found guilty. They were prosecuted and sentenced, and those that had a link to corruption were fired, and they were not reinstated to the police force. This was a very slow process. It was very slow at first. This was, of course, met with certain cynicism. People can be you at still today you can be you can find a lot of people who are cynical about the prospect. Cynicism is, of course, the enemy of hope, because it is easier to be cynical than to be hopeful. Um, but in terms of methodology, that was a very again, I'm simplifying a very complex process that took part in several stages, but this was what happened. And new recruits were integrated to the police force. These are young people who really were they were properly trained in previous government administrations in Honduras. A lot of police officers were just given a 3-month training, and they were just sent out to the streets just to meet some numbers, meet some quota. So this was what took place. People really have uh, more trust in a way in the police. They slowly but surely, uh, g- by all means, objectively and sub. Because those are two things, right? I mean, you can have objective numbers, but then you can have the subjective perception of people in terms of public safety and things like that. But uh, the reduction in the homicide rate has decreased significantly, and the perception of people in terms of that has positively increased as well. So um, it was, in summary, a very slow, hard, difficult, tough process. People were a lot of this. All of the people that were involved in the commission, in the police purge commission, they daily received death threats. Bodyguards were assigned to them. Like I said, their families had to leave the country. They definitely deserve all of the credit. There was a pastor, like I said, who was involved. 3 of the members in this police purge commission, were Christians, were committed Christians, brave Christians that were engaged in this process. So
it's really courageous. I would love to meet some of those folks someday. I mean, that's like raw grassroots on the ground doing the work, and it's, you know, it's very costly. So that's encouraging and also weighty to think about. All right, last question, and thanks for those who stayed around. I just thought these are some great questions to not give credence to. So we had a question, could you speak, so Elizabeth, could you speak to the recent news that DHS, or Department of Homeland Security, for those who don't speak in acronyms, DHS is requesting the assistance of states in sending National Guard to the southern border. Why is this happening, and what role will they play?
Yeah, so I actually was looking at some news articles to make sure I was recalling that the use of the National Guard at the border is not new. What made the news was that the Biden administration is going to continue that practice, and that particular numbers were, you know, in order to have troops at or National Guard at the border, you have to submit a request, and, you know, precisely the number you need and what the mission is that they're going to accomplish. And so that process happened in the March to May timeframe, and it you know, made news because of that. Generally speaking, they go to do non-law enforcement activity in support of the Customs and Border Protection mission, so that Border Patrol can focus on primarily Border Patrol functions. And it's just a product of, there's more work than they have people to do. When we were at when I was at DHS, one of the big initiatives was actually to increase the number of Border Patrol officials. We also had a big push to increase the number of Secret Service personnel, because anytime you have the workforce is too small for the mission, you end up burning people out. You see increases in divorce rates, increases in domestic violence among your own personnel, because like they just are, it's to do law enforcement work is mentally taxing enough. And usually people drawn to that mission are never going to say no when your boss asks you to work overtime. And it's just not healthy for a workforce to be perpetually in crisis mode, which several of our workforces sadly were. So we were trying to right size and get the right number so that people could work their shift and then go home and have family life and decompress. You add to it increasing surges at the border. They really had a manpower problem. And so one of the ways to supplement while they're staffing up is to ask for National Guard support. So it doesn't alarm me, because we are experiencing a surge at the border. And again, I'll put my security hat on. I don't like people crossing the border outside of the ports of entry, because then I don't know who they are. There are bad people that try to come in, usually not because they're a terrorist, that's actually extremely low, but they might be smuggling people or illicit drugs. We have a huge fentanyl problem. And it does, I mean, it does impact our communities. You guys are in the Pennsylvania area, right? So that is, you know, we have a huge opioid epidemic, and that is, you know, a byproduct of not being able to control what's coming across that border. It's more complex than that, but that is one thing that CBP is or Border Patrol is responsible for trying to prevent from coming in. So that doesn't concern me. The other side of this conversation, though, is that there has been in recent, I want to say in the last week even, several governors that have tried to make a big show of this. The Texas governor, I'm from Texas. I appreciate the people of Texas, but there's a bit of like a, you know, bravado going on of like, we're going to defend our own borders, and we're going to, you know, ask other states for National Guard support, which under mutual aid compacts states can do, but it's usually done in the context of, we just had a natural disaster, a hurricane hit, we need support. And those mechanisms are in place so that we can easily bring in additional National Guard to help a community in need. there's a little bit of, posturing there that I don't love. And the other piece of this is that it's like the borders, while a lot of authorities are given to the state, when it comes to our national borders, that is explicitly a federal responsibility. So then, the constitutional lawyers get really, when you start seeing state governors say, like, my law enforcement's going to go arrest people for federal crimes, which is kind of funny because I want law enforcement services to be partnering and to, help each other out, but like respectful of each other's authority. Like, there's things that federal law enforcement and federal entities should do, and then there are things that states should do, and we should mutually respect each other's roles and responsibilities. And anytime you get into this idea that the state governor is going to basically enforce immigration law, you're kind of like, yeah, it's not actually how the laws are written. And we are a society that governs by the rule of law. So I'm all for protecting your community. I totally get that sometimes things happen. You gotta do what you do to protect lives and keep people safe. But a lot of this is posturing, and a lot of this borders on thwarting the rule of law. And from that standpoint, I don't like it.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Elizabeth. It reminds me that I think a lot of times we all need to go have a refresher on civics. I nerdily read the entire set of Federalist Papers about 18 months ago. And you read through and you're like, oh, I really wish I paid attention to all of this, because the delineation of powers and who's responsible for what, I think sometimes it's convenient for talking heads and politicians to blur those lines for the sake of political bravado. And, if we all were like, we knew our good civics, like who's in charge of what, it's like, oh, no, that's local, that's state, that's federal. Thank you, Elizabeth and Luis. It's been such a pleasure listening to you both. I appreciate so much your expertise and your work. I'm going to close this out today. Thank you to everyone in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure we always have other states sneak into these. Wherever else you're from, thank you so much for being with us for the last hour or so. I will make sure that y'all get a follow-up link to a few of these things that we talked about, including the organizations represented on here. And just really appreciate your time. And if you have any questions, or you would like to see a different kind of event addressing some of these, whether it's digital or in your community, once your community is ready for in-person, you can send me an email about that as well. And I'd love to help you create something. Thank you, everyone, so much.